that was published, I think, in both Africa as a Country and possibly on Business Day. Is that right, Hilary? Yeah. And I think it's probably also known to many of us for her excellent piece in the South African Historical Journal on the kind of architecture of the land deal, which helped to keep the IFP somewhat on board with the transition process in the early 1990s, and just really an example of the terrific research and also often quite brave arguments that Hilary seems to like to make. And this piece, it's just, I was astonished, really. It looks like something that's going to be very important, even if not strictly in South African history as a field, but certainly in the broader universe of African history and presumably Soviet history. So, and I think Slavic studies more broadly. So thank you very much, Hilary, for presenting for us today and giving us all something to think about that doesn't involve water and electricity.
Thanks so much, Stephen, and thanks for inviting me. Thanks for everyone for showing up today. I appreciate it. There's all kinds of reasons not to, so that you did, it means a lot. And I'm excited to hear what you have to say about this piece. So like Stephen said, it's a co-authored piece, and Thom is teaching at Cardiff, so I'm here solo, and it's on me to do my best not to let him down. But I want to just tell you a little bit about this piece, where it came from and what it's for. So Thom and I know each other from Moscow, where we were both doing archival research before the pandemic at the same time on related PhD topics. So Thom's big dissertation is about African students in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, and my dissertation is about South African connections with the Soviet Union, and in particular, like a transnational history of the national question. So neither of those is specifically about the making of Blackness in the Soviet Union, but obviously, in order to do either of them justice, it was something we were continually grappling with, and that started in kind of informal conversations and then grew quite accidentally into this. And the problem was sort of how to make sense of race and racialization in a context where almost nobody was writing about it. And one way to think of what you read is that it's our best attempt at writing the article that we wish was available for us to read before tackling our own PhD projects. Whether we've succeeded at that is for you to decide, but that's kind of where it comes from. And it's intended for Slavic review, which means that its primary audience is not you, but experts in the former Soviet Union. And so I feel like I have to ask for patience with some of the kind of hand-holding, explaining basic ideas about the construction of race. This is for people who have never done that before and who have spent no time thinking about race, Blackness, Africa, any of the above. So there were a few people writing on those subjects before, and we kept noticing habits that they had that really troubled us pretty deeply. And I'll mention two. So one was this like strange tendency of treating Black students and visitors in the Soviet Union like they didn't really come from anywhere, like they had no particular history. And there's a version of this work that's especially preoccupied with like cataloging instances of racial violence, which definitely happened pretty frequently. But a lot of that scholarship never moves in any way beyond seeing Black people as sort of interchangeable objects of white violence. They never become more interesting than that. Their agency and their experience is never sort of highlighted. And then another kind of troubling habit was using a small handful of famous Black Americans, usually ones who wrote a lot. So Paul Robeson, Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, and sort of using them to stand in for every person racialized as Black. And that tendency, I think, is especially limiting and problematic in the way that it kind of ventriloquizes the continent. Africans never like speak for themselves, but have their experiences narrated by Black Americans. And the ultimate irony of that tendency is that the Comintern used to do that too, especially in the 1920s and the 30s. And so there's a way that scholars have ended up replicating a mistake from their subjects. So today's like this group of people is obviously a really different one. So what I hope South African historians get out of it is pretty different, totally different. And as you all know, and probably were reared in this sort of education style, it's for decades, South African historians have been reading, debating the Marxist tradition. And whether people were writing inside that tradition or outside of it, everybody was expected to know it. And I have to say, I've had the sense for years that in some ways that reading, that theoretical reading, sunk in maybe a little too deeply. And sort of like there hasn't been an opportunity for pretty obvious reasons for lots of immersion or empirical fieldwork in Russia, the former Soviet Union. And there's a way that I think it's possible historians of the South African left have relied a little bit too much on Marxist thought, on that body of Marxist thinking, to tell us what kind of a place the Soviet Union was. And so one hope for this piece is to break that habit or to make it harder to keep doing that. And then totally on the other side of the coin, South Africans have been hearing stories of anti-Black racism in the Soviet Union and in Russia for decades. So there's an opposing narrative that sees the Soviet Union as pretty much just another white power doing exactly the same white supremacist nonsense as its peers. And so in a way, this is like, it's an especially stark version of the contrast that we use to open our piece. On the one hand, the Soviet Union as raceless and exceptional, and on the other hand, the Soviet Union is anti-Black like all the rest. And so what we've aimed to do is to try to add complexity and make sense of these two kind of opposing narratives, both of which we think has some hold on the truth. The basic thing to emphasize is that the Soviet Union was a huge, sprawling multinational society that was built out of the ruins of the Russian Empire and was filled with something like 180, it depended on how they classified at different times, but different nationalities of people speaking different languages with very different histories of how they were incorporated into Russian imperial space. The Soviet Union changed dramatically over its lifespan, but I think we can say that at no point did it ever resemble a sort of neat expression of Marxist thought. And the last thing to sort of emphasize is that, and related to this paper, is that the challenge of how to conceptualize difference and how to institutionalize difference was crucial to the formation of the Soviet Union and also to its eventual collapse. So a couple of things to say about what we hoped to do with the piece, and not only what we hoped to correct or prevent. And there I see four basic things that we're trying to do. One, on the kind of most fundamental level, is to insist on seeing change over time and to offer a periodization for understanding those major shifts. A second is to insist that we should understand how Blackness was constructed in the Soviet Union as connected to internal processes of making and contesting difference. So there's a lot of ways that that's important, but especially here, and we've highlighted it everywhere we could, is the Soviet tendency to use Central Asians and Africans as like analogs for one another. The third aim is to show that the Soviet Union often either didn't have the choice or didn't have the creativity to do anything but follow broad shifts within the politics of the Black diaspora. They're often in a sort of, not in a leading position, but in a following one. And every time the Soviets tried to insist on defining things their way, it usually went badly, and they alienated a whole lot of people who they rather would have not lost as allies. And then the fourth sort of aim is to think about Soviet understandings of Blackness, especially through a particular lens, which is how did Soviet thinkers and policymakers understand the relationship between Africa and the diaspora? In the small subfield that exists, Africa has been awfully marginal, and it's been our effort to highlight again and again the sort of like the tortured ways that the Soviets were struggling to conceptualize Blackness to span both the continent and the diaspora. It exploded every category that they had for thinking about difference. And the best they could do was to pick up a little bit from Black radicals who entered their orbit, a little bit from their imperial rivals, and quite a lot, I think, from a series of analogies that had the purpose of telling them what it meant to be Black by comparing Blackness with something else. And with that, I will stop, but really excited about your questions. Thanks so much for reading.
Thank you, Hilary. Very, just so interesting. I'm going to open up obviously for questions and invite people to do the usual. Raise your hand, whether actual or virtual. If you would like to ask anything. Of course, I am prepared to step in as people percolate. All right, so let me do that while we wait for questions. So I thought, keep in mind that I had to skim it pretty fast, unfortunately, just because of life circumstances and jet lag and such. It looks to me pretty damn extraordinary, and I have to say that, of course, I should offer an apology, an additional apology immediately, which is to say, actually, this does, of course, have consequences for South Africanists too, as you reminded us. But nonetheless, as a grenade into, you said this, is it the Slavic Studies Review, that it does have that feel. And I hope that grenade is successful. And you know, I really like this argument about the danger of analogy generally, which strikes me as, I think, an important point to make. And yeah, so I'm not actually that well positioned to necessarily ask you very specific questions, but sort of one, as I was skimming, which did occur to me, which might just be an invitation to speak more, is the, let's call it Cold War solidarity work. And as you say at the end, that lovely phrase, solidarities are made, not given, of course. The other point is, I mean, I suppose the question is there more material that you could even have brought into this essay about on the ground kind of solidarity work in the kind of proxy battles of the Cold War on the continent? It certainly is seemed to me, correct me if I'm wrong, from my quick dirty read, to be something that you guys are thinking about, of course. And you know, you talk about the movement of people and exchanges and Cold War memoirs and students and activists and the connections between liberation movements on the continent and the Soviet Union. But is there even more? So is there a space for that kind of thing, even just in the verbal fleshing out? Because I mean, it just strikes me that we know that so much of the kind of Cold War solidarities, where of course it wasn't just the Soviet Union that were involved in this, but a lot of that stuff on the ground must have become pretty complicated and just been complicated necessarily. So can you tell me anyway more about that? So I suppose that's stuff about military aid, sometimes training, yes, and actual fighting, perhaps even on the ground, as part of the liberation movements and military campaigns.
Great, thanks for the question. So, there's a lot to say. One thing is that I think historians are just in the very beginning phases of periodizing what the sort of Soviet Cold War solidarity projects looked like, because the tendency has been, in some ways, as I'm doing my dissertation project, but to go country by country, and so building a kind of broader picture of what it all adds up to, and also what it looked like from a sort of larger policy perspective from the top, and then the messy ways that things worked themselves out on the ground. Those are still definitely things that are that we're learning about and people are publishing on all the time. I will say one thing that's not hugely emphasized in the paper that surprised me going into the Russian archives is how obsessed the Soviets were, particularly in the 1960s, with the Maoist threat. So in all of the documents that I looked at from that era, they talk very very little about sort of seeing the imperialist West as a real competitor. There's a sense of the imperialist as the enemy, but basically not as like serious competition. And that was pretty interesting to me and pretty surprising to me. And the things that they're really worried about are this kind of solidarity project that they launched in the late 1950s being undermined or sucked away by the Maoist project on the one hand, and then they become quite paranoid, like really paranoid about Black America and sort of Black power influences in a later period. And then the one, so you asked about weapons, and just quite briefly on that point, is that one of the most important shifts that is clear from kind of aggregating different people's country by country studies is that the Soviets like dove in fully to the development project in the 1960s, and their allies were newly independent countries trying to like build a dam and build a factory kinds of things. And that ran out of steam quite quickly. Alessandro Iondolo just published a book about Soviet connections to Guinea, Mali, and Ghana. That's great, and that argues that that project was pretty much exhausted by already 68. And the thing that replaced it was weapons. But if weapons is what you have to offer, you channel them to different recipients than if you have sort of development projects in an alternative model of what progress looks like. And so from the 1970s onwards, there's a strong Soviet shift towards arms as kind of the currency of aid, which means that they become really interested in the fight against settler colonialism. Palestine becomes more and more important in that era, as does South Africa. And especially after 76, after the Soweto uprising, there's a clear sense in the Soviet archives of like, aha, this is an important prestige project. This is a feather we need in our cap. And so like being on the right side of that one as the world kind of became more and more repulsed by what was happening here under the white government, became a matter of almost, I think that was more important than succeeding in overturning the white government, but sort of being on the right side mattered a lot. So that's like several different directions of trying to answer your question, but thanks.
Sorry, I've forgotten how to use the button. Julie.
Thank you so much. Hilary, this is a paper that I wish I had made the time to read 3 times. So if my questions come out of the left field, please just bat them away and say, this is not the paper. They come out of sheer curiosity because it was an extremely stimulating and fascinating paper. So thank you for that. I have 3 questions again, which you can just bat out of contention if they're not of interest to you. The first one is about a longer background history to constructions of race pre-Soviet Union. I hesitate to use terminology, but Russian, generally speaking, and a longer history of Blackness. Is there any association between Blackness and serfdom in any form? So that was one curious question. Another one is, have you come across any parallels with constructions of Africanness and Blackness? Again, you can really reject this question, by Chinese scholars or Japanese scholars, but there might be parallels. And the third one is stimulated by our own minister, former minister of goodness knows how many different things in her recent trip to Russia to get miraculous medical cures. I wanted to ask you if the connections between South Africa and Russia, how were those academic connections forged? How was medicine conceived as a kind of bridge between particularly Black South Africans and Soviet Russia, and what kind of connections can one tease out there? Sorry, slightly loose questions, but thank you for really stimulating paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. So you go for it, Hills. I'll get, we have Kyle and then Laura as well. We'll get to that, yeah.
Okay, thanks so much for the questions, Julie. And I'm going to bat none of them aside, but I'm going to tell you that question number 2, I am the wrong person to answer. So it's one that I would also love to know more about, but it's not something that I can speak to from a place of knowledge. But sort of briefly on the other 2 questions. So this is one of the parts of we wished for this article to be twice as long and to include lots of stuff that we couldn't include. And I think the thing that broke my heart the most was cutting out sort of longer reflection on not only race and Blackness, but sort of difference more generally in the Russian Empire, because it's quite a distinctive and interesting story that overlaps with more familiar European empire stories in particular ways, and also diverges from it. And so some brief things to say about that. Yes, there was a consciousness, especially from the sort of intelligentsia crowd, which is small and literate and usually kind of bored aristocrats who turn towards the left from the 1850s onwards. But they definitely, in their sort of campaigning against serfdom, were aware of and invoking the example of slavery in the United States as a sort of parallel. And the idea of kind of Russia's peasants being under the same yoke of oppression was really important. And yet the divide between the aristocracy, for most of the 19th century, the French-speaking aristocracy and the Russian-speaking peasantry was enormous, but was never exactly racialized in the same way that the divide between white slaveholders and enslaved people worked in the United States. And so there's ways that it's a really powerful analogy, and ways that it doesn't, like all analogies, doesn't quite mesh, but it's one people were thinking with. And then another important one, and in fact, the sort of, I would argue that the kind of ground zero for concepts of race in the Russian Empire definitely is a story about Jews and anti-Semitism. And that has a very long history, but in terms of kind of thinking in biological terms about a correlation between phenotype, descent, culture, behavior, and all the rest that's sort of packaged into racialized thinking, it's definitely Russian anti-Semitism that I think is the most potent and really, if racism can be sophisticated, like elaborate and sophisticated system, that these ideas that are much newer sort of graft themselves onto. And then one other thing to mention is that Pushkin himself had a black, great-grandfather, but one of his ancestors was black, and that was sort of highlighted as part of the Russian court's imperial image in the era where Pushkin was busy defining the meaning of the Russian language. So that's something that sort of came up in the Soviet period as a way of saying we've been on the side of Black struggles all along. Just again, maybe a bit of a stretch, but and then your third question about academic connections and about medicine. This is one of the huge changes from the first generation of students who go in the 1920s and 1930s to the second generation that go from the 60s onwards. There's a much smaller number of people who go in the 20s and 30s, and they're all pretty much committed revolutionaries going for ideological and political training. And the generation of students from a much broader array of African countries, of which South Africa was relatively tiny, the sort of generation of the 1960s were mostly focused towards technical fields. They still had ideological and political education. And if you studied medicine or agronomy, you'd still have to take classes on dialectical materialism. But the sort of, the self-image was of the Soviet Union wanting to train the technical experts who would go out and staff development projects across the entire global South. And it didn't entirely work that way, but the fields that are really important are like agronomy, medicine, economic planning, things like that, that are not like may or may not have a sort of distinctly ideological bent to them. And it's also a very big difference in terms of who was interested in going to the Soviet Union. It becomes one of many options for a place where a bright young African student could get a degree in medicine, which is very different from the way that someone would have looked at it in the 1920s. That was a sort of revolutionary commitment to make your way to Moscow in the earlier days. I hope that helps in answering. Thanks for the questions.
Can the archives tell us how well our previous ministers did in dialectical materialism?
Yes, but with several caveats. One is that people from my country are banned from Russia right now, so I can't tell you. And two is that he would have to request his own records. So someone would have to convince him to do so.
All right, excellent. Very, very interesting. So we have quite a nice queue building up, and I'm going to abuse my responsibility by suggesting that we go with some of the postgraduate students first before some of the other people in the queue, if that's fine with people. So I've got Kyle and then Amanda, and then we'll get to some of the other people, including Laura and others. Kyle.
Hey Hilary, this is a great paper. And the timing is quite awesome because I've been thinking a lot about the material effects of the material, social, cultural effects of the environment of someone like Thom or Berkeley going to Moscow, going for training, going for their political tasks, trying to build up support for MK and such. So like I think this is a fantastic way to contextualize what's happening. Would you please forgive me for leaning into the stereotype of a South Africanist and asking a super parochial South African question? So how do the different exposures of folks that in the ANC that go and train in Moscow manifest in different kind of ideological positions, different sort of I don't know, social political orientations? How does that manifest in the kind of struggle politics of the ANC? So I mean, like, learning dialectical materialism in Moscow is an entirely different experience from living in a camp in Zambia, for example, right, in an MK camp, trying to avoid getting hit by apartheid security forces. So what are the kind of long-term consequences for these kind of visions of blackness and these experiences of blackness in Moscow versus, you know, being a frontier revolutionary?
It's a great question, and it's a hard one to answer because of a complexity that I'm going to try to capture right now, which is that people who went, so even in this period that you're talking about, even in the 1960s, there are basically three broad categories of people who went. I mean, that's fudging a little bit, but we'll take it. So one is usually party leaders or relatively elite folk who went to Moscow for a kind of continuation of that ideological training. And Becky was one of them. He was at the Lenin School in the end of the 1960s. Yusuf Pahad went there, several, like that kind of person went to those places. And then there's the crowd of people who, starting in 1962, went for the kind of technical degrees that I was talking about. And a lot of them studied in Kyiv or in Baku, like to learn about the oil industry, and ended up all over the Soviet Union. And so that's a much less ideological and more technical kind of exposure, and usually much more immersed, the most immersed in sort of local society. So the Lenin School students were quite a privileged crowd, associating them with other revolutionary notables from the rest of the world. And most of them, in one way or another, had pretty good experiences. That's a big generalization, but I think I stand by it. Because they were curated to a degree that the rest of them weren't. The students who lived there for 5 or 6 years and had to learn Russian and have classes in Russian, that's a much more mixed bag in terms of how people felt leaving, whether it was a good place to have been that they're going to be loyal to for their lives, or whether it's an anti-Black nightmare. It's a real mix. And then the third group are soldiers in camps. So MK training was mostly in Odessa and Crimea, the MK soldiers that trained in the Soviet Union. And they were pretty insulated from local society in every way, didn't learn Russian, and were sort of kept at a different distance on purpose. And so it's really fragmentary exposure among people who went for military training, and pretty hard for them, I think, to say that they have any kind of deep immersion in Soviet life to draw on. And so of those categories, certainly the first, the Lenin School crowd, came back usually with the most enthusiasm, and kind of held down. I mean, but Thabo Mbeki is the great exception to that. Nobody thinks of him as a lifelong communist. And so I tend to think of these things instead of a top-down version of influence, that people went looking for different things in the Soviet Union, and tended to find what it was they were looking for. And sometimes that was classes on dialectical materialism, and sometimes they napped all their way through it.
Excellent. Thanks, Hilary and Kyle. So Amanda, would you like to ask your question out loud? Amanda?
Hello, Dr. Sparks. Good afternoon, everyone. I don't think my internet is stable enough, but if it's fine,
Yes, we can hear you. Go for it.
Read my question. So I want to know whether or not Hilary used oral history, as in did she interview people? And then if she did she find any inconsistencies between what she found in the archives and what people were saying or what people were telling her? And then if she actually did notice or discover those inconsistencies, how did she solve or close the gap between those two? Thank you.
Thanks so much. That's a really thoughtful and useful question about sources, and also not easy to answer, because I think with very few exceptions, and there are some exceptions, but with few exceptions, most of the oral histories that I did, people want to tell quite a rosy story, a really beautiful, meaningful story of their time in the Soviet Union, and talking about things that were hard, unless it's like The Cold or something kind of climactic but politically neutral, tends to be quite difficult. And it's always a challenge for people who do this type of work to know what to do with those quite romanticized oral accounts, because on the one hand, I think there's a crowd of historians who say, oh, they're all mired in nostalgia, forget about it, we'll go with these much more negative, usually memoirs that were published at the time, and usually with the British Foreign Office or the US State Department helping the process along. And the total discounting of how people actually remember their experiences strikes me as pretty limiting and unfair. And as much as we can sort of see the nostalgia with which people remember, it's no reason to kind of chuck out interviews. And the other thing that I think is really important is that the alternative to interviews in terms of accounts from South Africans tends to be published, more memoir-y type stuff. And because just that type of writing has been historically really dominated by white voices, who I am quite sure from my research tended to experience the Soviet Union very differently. And I think there's a real problem in relying on that type of published material from Brian Bunting and Ruth First and the rest of that kind of mid-century communist crowd, because there's lots and lots of stories that those don't tell. And then the third perspective is what the Soviet state thought it was doing. And all I can say is yeah, there are huge inconsistencies, but there's something interesting about the inconsistency between, on the one hand, what the Soviet Union was trying to do, and on the other hand, what students and visitors actually experienced and what they took away with them. And the gap between sort of intentions and experiences isn't necessarily a problem of sources, but is a kind of site of historical insight on its own. But thanks for the great question.
Yeah, very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda and Hilary. I think it's a lovely discussion, actually. So now I think we can go with, there is still a nice queue. Justin?
I think Laura was actually there first in the chat. So
yeah, I wasn't sure. So okay, by all means. Actually, why don't let's bundle them. So Laura, then Justin, and I think Thembisa and Ariana. But let's go first with Laura.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Hilary. What an interesting paper. I did put my question in the chat, but effectively what I'm asking about is the category of ethnicity and what, in the Soviets' mind, the relationship is between Blackness and ethnicity. And I didn't quite get to the end of the paper, but I was just flipping through it again now, and I see that ethnicity, and if I'm remembering correctly about how you and other people have discussed this, and I know very little about Russia and the Soviet Union, but ethnicity is often how the Soviets are thinking about breaking up their own population. So what is the relationship between that idea of ethnicity and any idea of ethnicity and Blackness, if there is one? Thanks.
Justin?
hi, thanks for a fascinating paper, Hilary. I mean, my question is really about how non-Black people who went to the Soviet Union as part of liberation movements, and I'm thinking particularly of South Africa and Angola here, because these are these are the cases I'm most familiar with. If, say, a Ronnie Kasrils or a white or mixed race Angolan arrives in the Soviet Union, do you see any difference in how the Soviets are talking about them? I mean, I won't elaborate further, but you know, I think it speaks back to all sorts of debates that go on within Angola, and particularly about the tensions within the MPLA, in which this idea of proletarian internationalism is used to kind of draw a smokescreen over quite deep racial divisions within those movements, and I think in a slightly different way within the ANC and SACP as well. So I'm just interested to know how if at all, non-Black Africans are seen from the Soviet side.
And let's just take Thembisa, and then we'll come back to Ariana. Thembisa?
Thanks. I so enjoyed this paper, and it was just such a pleasure to read. It was so succinct and just so well written, and I just thought it was such a great intervention. My question's very, very brief, and I think it follows Laura's. I just like to know whether the word foreigner what it might be in Russian, and whether it was at all important in the same way that we see it as significant in a xenophobic politics in places like the US and the UK, South Africa. Did it have any purchase for discussions of Blackness or Africanness at all?
Go for it, Hilary. We'll come back to Ariana and anyone last ones.
Great. Thanks so much. These are great. I'm going to work, I think, backwards. So from Thembisa's question, the question about foreigners is really, really a fraught one. And there's several reasons why that's the case. The word in Russian is innocence, and foreigners in the Soviet period, there's a sort of wild oscillation between periods of openness to the world and sort of revolutionary fervor that involves inviting the world in, and intense xenophobia, to the point where in the late 1930s, if you were found to have foreign connections, that could be a reason to end you, that you would end up in a prison camp or losing your life. And so the most closed period by far is from the kind of 36 until basically Stalin's death in 53. And then things start to change and open up again after that. But there's always these kind of shifting. So one thing that comes up in interviews is that people of color who went to the Soviet Union will say, oh, but Soviets were just skeptical of all foreigners, as a kind of way of marginalizing questions of anti-Black racism. And there's ways in which that's true, probably has some legitimacy to it. But there's also, like, given the stories that East German exchange students and Czech exchange students and people who are sort of unquestioned in their whiteness, given what they report from their Soviet experiences, it seems like there's something there that doesn't totally add up. Yeah, it's a tricky one, and it remains a tricky one. And one thing that I would relate it to goes back to Justin's question, actually, which is often mixed race South Africans had a possibility of being read as one of the Soviet nationalities, and the same with Indian South Africans. And so they would often get placed as sort of semi-locals in a way that Black South Africans were not, could not, and never, yeah, that was impossible for them. And so there are all these stories in the archive of like moments of misrecognition where someone thinks that a mixed race South African is from Uzbekistan and starts speaking to them in Russian and realizes that they've made an error, and try to backtrack, and sometimes like things get violent out of that. But there's definitely a kind of distinctive, like foreignness is broken down into several categories, I think is the thread of what I'm trying to say. Justin's question is also, it's a tricky one because this is a tension that was never sorted out in the relevant Soviet bureaucracies, because on the one hand, they were sure that sort of a South African liberation movement, for example, should be led by Black people. And so there was a strong sort of, like, I don't know, essentialist preference for not having white faces at the front of a liberation movement in an African country. And yet there's also extended rants all over the place about Black racism and the dangers that it poses, and the sort of the Soviet Union as a shining beacon of multiracial coexistence. And those tensions are sort of held within the bureaucracies and within the academic institutes, and people pull in different directions. So I wouldn't say there's sort of one answer, but it's definitely a live question for people on that side. And then Laura's question about Blackness and ethnicity. So ethnicity, called nationality in the Soviet context, is a formal category, and every Soviet person has in their passport their official nationality. And you have only the degree of choice over your nationality that you can choose one of either of your parents' nationality. So it's definitely connected to blood and descent, with a very small element of when you're 16, you get to choose which path you'll be on for the rest of your life. And there's no Black category. And one sort of telling anecdote on this is that Lily Golden, who's briefly mentioned in the paper and was one of the first Africanists in general at the Africa Institute, and always the only Black one. She was born in Soviet Uzbekistan. Her father was a Black American who had immigrated in the early 1930s. And when it came time, when she was 16 years old and needed to register for a passport, they asked her ethnicity, and initially wrote Uzbek, because she was born in Uzbekistan. And she said, no, I'm not Uzbek. That's not going to work. I'm American. And they told her, American is not an ethnicity. That's also not going to work for us. And they go through a sort of long back and forth process of arguing over what ethnicity they're going to write down, and eventually settle on Negro, Negritianka, as what will fit, because that is it's a marker of descent in a way that, like, American is not. And so there's definitely overlap in these categories and in the way that they become sort of primordialized and biologized, but they never totally sink into one another. And the Soviet Union, like, had in its constitution all along a kind of formal ban on racial discrimination, but then things get very tricky when like the category of institutional difference, ethnicity, the ways that that differs from race is never really clear or stable. That's a great question.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. So do you want to ask your question out loud, Ariana, or are you fine with me reading it?
Hi, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Hilary. Sorry, I'm in the middle of trying to sort out household problems, but I had a question about your use of some terms in the paper. I put it in the chat, but I'll say it again. One is the use of the term people of African descent, but it seems to me you're speaking about Africans, not the African diaspora. And then about the use of Black Africans, which comes from Black Americans, and to me sounds like an Americanism. And then I wanted to ask you about where the term honorary Africans or Blacks in reference to Central Asians come from, if it's your own, something you've come up yourself, because obviously we are familiar with the idea of honorary whites in the South African context. I've never heard of honorary Blacks, so I was just curious of the origins of this term and what the meaning of it is in this context. Thanks.
I think you can go for it. I don't have any other questions lined up.
Okay, those are, so Ariana, you're asking the really hard questions, because settling on a vocabulary, I don't know, Thom and I went back about this over and over again, and I think, I don't know, it's possible erred wrongly in one direction or another, and I would definitely accept that criticism of like the problem that we identify at the beginning of how are we supposed to label a group of people that we're then going to track the social construction of is like a chicken and egg thing that it's very, if you have a suggestion for what the right answer would be in that scenario, terminologically, I'd love to hear it. We debated and went around and around, and I think in some ways tried to choose flexible and mixed terminology rather than something really like brutally consistent as a way of making a nod to different ways of thinking about race and racialization in different contexts. But it's also, yeah, totally accept the point that may have not worked as we hoped. The honorary Africans point is a really interesting one to me, because that comes more in the term Black than African, of using chorny, which means Black, and is most commonly used in a sort of late Soviet and post-Soviet context to refer to people from the Soviet South, from the Caucasus and Central Asia. And the way that like Africans got lumped into that category as also chorny, while sharing like nothing historically or culturally in particular, is a really interesting history, and I think one that needs to be researched a lot further. It's something that Thom and I noticed in documents, but can't, I think we tried to phrase it in quite a open and possibly vague way that we know that happened from the 60s onwards, but identifying a sort of origin point of when people started doing that and how, I don't know. It's a question for more research, and actually research I would really like to do. But that word chorny is the sort of link that it's used to describe both Central Asians and Africans.
Yeah. Did I just turn your video off, Hilary? I didn't mean to. One of the great things about the piece is that it does say that there's possible avenues for more research. So thank you very much. I think we can leave it at that. You've given us a lot to think about, and I think you've given South Africanists some stuff to think about, but hopefully your intended main audience is also provoked and also does some careful thought in response to this piece. So thank you, Hilary. Thank you, everyone. And best of luck with water and such.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for reading. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye, everyone. See you soon.